Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal's Polyglot Software Development Podcast. Our guest today is Leigh Lawhon. Leigh has an extensive background in product management, front-end development, UX UI design. Having taught coding and design for over 15 years, she's a lifelong learner and is currently learning LXD and machine learning. Very nice to have you here.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
I'm very excited. The topic for today, I know you had proposed a number of topics, and the one we picked is why transparency is important for the success of a software project. Now, this is a broad topic, so
Yeah.
I'm going to have you kick this off, and then we'll let the conversation flow, and then we can share each of our experiences and perhaps speak to why sometimes these things like they might come across as stating the obvious, but when you dig deeper we know why what transparency means in the context of a software project, what nuances it could possibly have, and what happens if you have plenty of it, some of it, or none of it. And we can talk about all of those things. So without further ado, we can just kick this off. So if you could just give a brief introduction about yourself, and then we can kick the topic.
Yeah. I've been a coder for I think I was a React coder for about 10 years. I still code today. Right now, this morning actually, I was building a Python React chatbot and playing around with that. So I don't know that I'll ever not be a coder. But I have moved into product management, and I have seen as a product manager, I've seen some interesting dynamics and as a product manager who's been a developer, I often advocate for my developers. Sometimes they're left in the dark, and so um, one of I guess I'll start with the idea of why we're doing something. That is typically the job of the product manager to get to the why of something. And that involves typically um, working with the business leadership, working with the users, and then working with the developers. And if you have a good product manager, information flows both ways and everything's good. But sometimes product managers get busy, or perhaps they're new to the industry and they don't quite understand the need for developers to understand the why of what they're doing. And often things just get thrown over the wall, right, to the developer, and just go do this. Here's the user stories and the acceptance criteria, figure it out. And there's this gap often between what the developers do, even what the product managers do and say, and even, for instance, like what the UX UI designers do and say. I was also, like you said, a UX UI designer. And it's almost like task over that wall, rather than an understanding of why we're all doing this. And so I've seen that in a couple of different ways. So for instance, I recently saw an interface. I also teach, and so these aren't always companies that I work for. It's sometimes just uh, student projects. But I saw an interface that used D3JS as an interface, and as a developer, I'm like, that's super cool. I love working in D3JS.
Right.
I did one project that I absolutely loved, but this particular tool was for children, and so not quite a great interface, especially when you're dealing with children or a wide audience. A lot of the times you've got to consider accessibility, right? Is it is it easy to click around and utilize the interface? And so what the developer might just get, hey, go redo this, and here's how it's done, or we're going to design it this way, without really understanding why the decision was made. Alternatively, developers sometimes make decisions that the other side of the wall doesn't understand. So I know I've worked with a lot of UX UI students, and they'll design this really cool, beautiful drop down, for instance, right? And they'll throw it over the wall, and the developer will come back and either be like, no, that's not how we're doing it, or do it in a way, it can be a bunch of different ways. Like obviously, if they're using a framework on the development side, the least expensive way to do that is to use, a drop down from, let's say, if they're using Bootstrap. If they were to go for the really elegant design and all the nitty gritty stuff, it's going to be more expensive. It's going to be more of their time. It's going to cost more. And so, the developer probably has every right to push back on that. And it's that pushback across the gap that really requires communication, understanding, and a little bit of softness, because as a product manager, for instance, I have to push back and say no all the time. I'm sure you are
You know,
familiar with that.
Leigh, I was
Yeah.
gonna. This is awesome. You kicked it off in the best way. The beauty is when I said the name of the topic, typically the topics start at the 30,000 foot level, and then you work your way through to getting deeper and deeper. The beauty of talking, I think personally, to another fellow developer, is like it takes all of 2 minutes to go from the top of Mount Everest to literally, you. I think it's beautiful the way you put it. I'm gonna dig, just touch upon each of those things that you mentioned, and probably just
Sure.
restate some of them as well. So the problem you mentioned beautifully. Every stakeholder in a team. Let's take. I'm going to come up with an example just so it makes the conversation easier for folks to follow. And if it makes sense, a lot of times I don't draw very well. I wish I could, but I use it. I still think pictorially. So we could
Mhm.
probably draw some of this up, even if not in the first podcast. Perhaps I can convince you to come to the next one if I do an okay enough job. That is. Uh,
Of course.
here's the problem. Let me just come up with a problem. One of the things my wife, as a company, we do many things at Snowpal. One of the things we do is build APIs and backends as services for other businesses. Uh, One of the things we talked about recently, my wife was like, okay, if we built, not going to the specific details, but one of her examples was if it's a rainy day, you feel like eating a certain kind of food. And it I come from the southern part of India, and there's a certain food that goes with tea, and when it's raining, it's pouring cats and dogs. That's typically one of two things that everybody feels like they want to eat. And she was
Hmm.
like, hey, as we build one of our next APIs, if it's cognizant to something like this, it would be interesting. So you don't go place the order. It actually tells you. I'm actually letting this idea slide for whatever it's worth. But she said, you know what? It should actually prompt you to say, perhaps you want to, it's called budgie. It's Bhaggi, I think is how it's
Uh-huh.
spelled. It's like a fried dough, and then you have it with tea.
Sounds
So that's an
delicious.
example, right?
Uh-huh.
So let's take this as a problem. You have an app, you have a mobile app, for instance. It's all implemented, or it could be web, whether it's React or React Native, doesn't matter. uh, and somebody's implementing this functionality. Perhaps you could, if this example is not ridiculous, we can just take this and see what happens when there is that level of transparency and when there isn't, and
Right.
what differences it could possibly make. But before we get into that, I also want to agree to one more thing that you said, which is, if you say build something and I'm a developer, if you give me all the flexibility, and I'm just saying this a little bit differently than the way you put it, but I'm saying the exact same thing. Tell me, Krish, go build this page. My first instinct is going to be, let me use the existing components that I have in my design
Right.
system.
Yes.
Why should I reinvent the wheel? I understand the functionality. As a startup, we are very agile in what we do. So we're like, okay, you know what? We have a conversation over Zoom for like 30 minutes, and then we start coding. But if as the organizations get larger, a bit more bureaucracy is going to seep in naturally. So you have more documentation before you get to that point. But what I'm trying to convey here is, when you tell me, give me all the flexibility, I'm going to do it the quickest way possible.
Right.
But that does not mean it aligns with you as a product owner or a product manager, because you have a certain idea and a purpose in mind. Even though you told me, Krish, implement this so people can actually be prompted to what they could potentially order when it's raining outside. What if I did not care for whether it was snowing outside, whether it's sunny outside? It's kind of a weird manufactured example, but hopefully it makes some sense, right? Because I could be very myopic. I could use the existing components, go implement in the quickest possible manner, and feel like, okay, I'm an awesome developer. And you'll be like, you know what? I didn't give you the entire big picture because that's not important. I can't teach you. I mean, it's not possible for the product owner to tell everything,
Hmm.
because nothing will ever get done. So you told me minimum that you needed to sort of share with me as a developer, so that could have cost I produce the result, but maybe that result is not in line with what you have in the roadmap, for instance. So I don't know. This is I just took an example. Want to hear
Yeah.
your thoughts on it.
Yeah, first and foremost, I want to add an additional layer to that. So what you're the example that you're giving probably involves some sort of chat GPT, right? To give recommend or some sort of recommendation. Um, I think it's really an interesting time for product managers, developers, UX, UI designers, because there is this mental shift, right? And even knowing what is and is not possible. A designer might come up with something if they're not familiar with the technology, or a product manager, if they're not familiar with the technology, may come up with a feature that you know seems possible. In the commercialized world, but in reality, the execution world isn't quite possible. I'm actually working on a project like that right now, um, but in the exam, so there's that additional aspect to it, which also relates to the the gap between those roles and the lack of transparency. And you're right, a product manager may only give a little bit of information just so that the developer can focus on the little bit of functionality. And developers do their jobs every day so well, keeping the production streamlined, being dry, reusing components. And it's, ultimately, um, even though um, you have these two teams that speak totally different languages, um, it is really a great idea to continually meet and continually communicate ideas so that everybody kind of stays aligned. That tends to be a lot of meetings. Nobody likes a lot of meetings. So there's ways to kind of, I've found, to streamline, to get that communication to run a little bit smoother. One of the things that I think is super important that comes up on every project is keeping the vocabulary the same. So, marketing and a product manager might call this button call to action. The developers might call it the primary button. There's all sorts of names for specific components, and by keeping the language, at least the bits and pieces, the language of the bits and pieces the same, really helps smooth the communication. And I personally encourage both my developers and my designers to adapt the language of the user, which is which typically comes from marketing. A lot of times it is from user interviews and things like that. So building out a shared vocabulary across the teams is really helpful. Certainly, visuals are super helpful in bridging that gap, and that's where UX UI designers come in. Being able to quickly communicate typically involves images. You communicate much quicker with images than you can, especially clickable prototypes, than you can just descriptions. And so you know you know they look for things to facilitate that conversation. A lot of times, I will tell you, a lot of times I tell my UX UI design students, learn to code so that you understand what is possible, what's not possible, why developers make certain decisions, because that why is just as important as why you're doing, XYZ for the user. And I tell my developer friends as well, it's important to learn UX UI concepts so that you don't I will say, like, and I'm been guilty of this myself. Developers tend to think of, they have one problem and they think of all the edge cases that could potentially uh, fall into play for that one interaction. A lot of times they're doing it to prevent bugs, right?
Right.
That's their job. But as a UX UI designer, you want, it's too much for the interface. It's too varied. The interact, and I'll give you an example here in a second, but the interaction is too saturated, and you want to really reduce and streamline that interaction for the user in the best possible way. So, I worked on an interface that was developed by, it was already developed by the developers. I came in as an kind of an afterthought from the company and redesigned the user interface. And it just happened to be for a cancer assay interface. And that's where you have it's for cancer diagnostics, and it's where you have this tray and it's got the little pipettes that go into all the little 96 holes, and they put it in the machine and it tells, this guy or this person has cancer, this one doesn't. So it's a really interesting interface. In that particular case, the original developer so it's 96 spots, and each spot represents a patient and their diagnosis and their gene. There's a lot of information for each spot. The developer squeezed as much information into each one of these little spots on the interface as they could, because they wanted to make sure that, for instance, if a scientist needed this bit of information, they could see it immediately. Well, of course, that created a very complex, hard to read interface. And so what I did was use the technique of progressive reveal. So revealing information as an individual needed it. I also used the technique of, rather than using text, using symbols to kind of clean up the interface. And that's kind of that's kind of where I think UX UI and development butt heads a little bit. It's been it's flow. It is more psychology, I think. Getting people to do and understand things without telling them how to do and understand things. That's kind of the UX UI side of it. The development side is very much about steps in a process. It's very much about I'm trying to think of a term from about algorithms. Just processes, steps in a function. So I probably got off topic there for
No. I think you're on topic there. So let me say, uh, your examples are perfect, right? The question I have there is, you talk about good UX UI or not so good UX UI, but I want to say, is there such a thing? Because what I'm trying to ask here, even without even asking the question, is, does it depend on many different things? Like, is it something you could, if I'm building a piece of software for a certain part of the world, which is different from, say, the two of us, we live in the US. You're building software for, say, companies, for users in South Asia, Southeast Asia, in Africa, in South America. I have a feeling sometimes UX and UI, it's looked at, hey, this is the way to go about things. This is a good way to do it. This is not that good. But as you build software for different parts and different regions and different cultures, it plays not just a small role. In my opinion, it plays a dramatic role. And I'll give you an example. Hopefully, this is an all right example to give. If you go to Indian websites, for instance, built for organizations that are exclusively run in India,
Mm-hmm.
you will see the user interface is very different. Quite different from the way I would actually approach that problem. Very different, actually, very different from how I would go about it. And it's not once or twice. I've seen it time and again. The choice of colors, the size of the fonts, the selection of the font family, how the text is placed, what kind of components are chosen. Everything is very different. And I don't want to generalize. It's a large country, but I'm saying at least the products I've seen have, they've changed over the years, but they've come across very differently. So if someone asked me to build it as a company, I would have thought very differently. And then I try to dig deeper to find out if this is exactly what somebody wanted, or was this just what the team was capable of producing and building, whoever did it, for instance. Now, that's not always an easy answer to find out. It's sometimes a combination of multiple things. And if I want to bring the geography down, scope it down further, uh, even if you're building it, let's say we're building it for a client in the US, can maybe the question becomes easier, but my question really is, can we say that, hey, this is the best way, or one of these are
Right.
one of two of the best ways to go about things? Or can there be a wide spectrum, meaning your company's paradigms are very different, your
Mhm.
user base is very different, their expectations are different, their demographic is different. You've been in business a long enough time that your users have been with you for years, so maybe they don't want dramatic changes. Even if you want to build a beautiful UX and a new UI based on very meaningful 2024 user experience, they might still reject it because they're like, you know what, I just need to get whatever I need to get done. Why are you expecting me to relearn this? So, what are some of those things that should play a role in design that you've seen them play or not play a role and make quite a bit of a difference?
Yeah, I've got two very good examples that nail it. But like, yeah, you can UX UI design changes day to day. It changes from region to region. It changes from user to user. There is no good UX UI, user experience UI design. There, it's just constantly evolving. Just the way software development best practices constantly evolve. But if you think about like culture and a general fit to the entire world, obviously it doesn't exist. So like if you think about movies, right, there's the Hollywood type movie, but there's also the beautiful Bollywood type movie, right? And so they're influenced by their cultures, and one's not better than the other. They simply are, they start from the same need to create a movie, but then they diverge and are influenced by their cultures. And you are absolutely right? It really plays an understanding of your user persona really plays an important role into the why of what you're building and why you're building it. So two very good examples in my career. I have had this happened twice, and each time it shocked me. But I'll give you one example. I was building basically a progress tracker, a workflow tracker for a company. And so you can imagine, I'm a young designer, and so we've all kind of worked with Kanban boards, and it was, I think, kind of somewhat new. It's been a while.
Right.
I've been in the industry for a while, but so it was like, great, Kanban. It's progressing through this workflow. Everything's great, and so I did this whole design. And the industry, I'll tell you the industry because it will help you understand it. But this was a bunch of this was in the chemistry field, right? They tested they primarily tested and organized chemicals. And so, I did this great design, put it in front of the users, and they hated it. And I think their exact words were, "Well, this doesn't look like Excel." And that was very good. And actually that happened twice. I had another group who actually built out their application in Excel, and we did a beautiful design from the ideas in their application. And again, they said, "Well, this doesn't look like Excel." So it's not even necessarily culture or, um, uh, culture or age or, different demographics, right? Both of these cases, these individuals were used to working in Excel. And because I completely changed the interface to something more modern, and you'd think it was more easy because they can just drag and drop between the processes, and you would think that they'd be like, "Oh, this is so much easier." But there's a psychology to UX UI, where designers want to make the experience simple, but sometimes the the user experience, your user base is used to X, right?
Right.
And so the learning curve for them to get to what you built is up here. And so, it's not, they're going to reject it, right? So you have a couple of choices. You kind of gradually move them to a
Absolutely.
better interface, right? And again, that would take a couple of redesigns. You can also include kind of tutorials in the interface and things like that. But, I personally feel that if you have to explain the interface, that's typically what is considered not good UX, right? It needs to be intuitive. Having an intro video of, here's where this is, here's where that is, rather
Yeah,
than,
if you have to explain anything,
yeah,
even if it's a method that you're writing, if there's like 6 lines of comments on the top of a method that's 4 lines, you could have written that better, right?
right,
It's just as simple as that. So, I agree with you. It needs to be iterative. It needs to be iterative so you can get feedback on what those changes are and how your user community is reacting to those changes. But let me add one more level of complexity here. There are times there is a change in the user interface or the design or the experience. It is iterative, and it may or may not be iterative, but regardless, it changes the way you have to do things, but it does not provide any meaningful value to the user. that
right,
that to me, I want to take that as an example. I was able to, order food, or, it was raining, so I got a certain kind of food that features already been there. Now I revamped this feature. It looks cooler. Maybe I use better, components. Everything is nicer. Um, but it did not make any meaningful difference to me. Like if I'm ordering food through, say, the Kava app, for instance, which we do,
hmm,
it again, it is easy to have opinions, Lee, right? When it comes to user interface and UX, when we are working on APIs as a company, we hear a lot less feedback than when we build interfaces. Because if somebody's walking down my street, if I drag them into the house, if they had nothing to do with UX or UI, they would still have a comment or two about what they're seeing.
right,
Whereas if I brought them in and I showed them APIs, they'll be like, "Oh, I have no idea what this is. I could care less." So I
yeah,
think it's much more challenging being a UX UI designer, because everybody's going to have an opinion,
yeah,
and unfortunately you cannot entertain all opinions or please everybody either. But what I'm trying to understand here is, or the example that I took of Kava app is, they have a pretty rich interface on the app, but to me personally, it's too rich to my liking. In other words, when I add each of the toppings to my veggie bowl, for instance, it's got a lot of these pictures and everything. I'm like, I don't want to see the
yeah,
falafel every single time. I know what the falafel is. It doesn't change. Kava's had the same thing for like n number of years. To me, it's very noisy.
yeah.
Whereas like a Panera interface, or was it Potbelly or something, it was very simple for me to click, 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 and I'm done with it. That's pretty much what I needed. So I want to ask this: the richness of the interface. I mean, is it overrated? Is coolness overrated? Sometimes we are humans. Technologies change, but I mean, we change not as exponentially as the technologies that we use might change.
Hmm.
So, should UX be cognizant of what are some of the, if I asked you what are the top 5 things, as if you wore the hat of a UX designer, and if I asked you what are the 5 things that you actually, not 50, not one, but 5 things that you would pick as the most important, and maybe even in that order, what would those be?
Most important, so you hit on a couple of things I want to address.
Sure.
So the most important aspects of before you or while designing, is that the question?
Right.
Yeah.
Not most, sorry, the question is, if hell broke loose and you got everything else wrong, if these 5 things were done more or less correctly,
Oh,
things
got
would
it.
be things would
Yeah.
be mostly fine.
First and foremost, visual hierarchy. So visual hierarchy is the concept of, just in the same way as like when you were in maybe high school or college, you wrote out an outline and there was level one, level two, level three, and then you jump out to level one again. Or as a developer, you understand, HTML hierarchies, H1s, H2s, H3s. Um, visuals have a hierarchy, and there are certain tools, for instance, that you can use to in kind of levers you can turn to increase hierarchy or decrease hierarchy. So what that typically means is when you look at a page, most people can kind of track up to three, sometimes four or five levels in their head. And so again, certain things increase hierarchy. For instance, contrast, keeping the contrast high. Highest contrast is black and white. Um, you can also use, like for instance, shape. A round shape is going to be higher contrast, especially if the rest of it is square, uh, on your page. So using a visual hierarchy to identify the top, for instance, 3 items on your page, so that you're talking about very rich interfaces, very overwhelming interfaces. A lot of that is because the visual hierarchy is somewhat diluted, right? If you
Right.
keep the visual hierarchy very crisp, boom, boom, boom. I see what I want, I click what I want, I press add to cart. Those are the 3 things that are high contrast, on your page, that have a high visual hierarchy.
Okay.
Um, that's number one, keeping it clean and clear. Um, I think
I mean, 5 was not unreasonable ask of me because I'm just
I was gonna say that's a
you
lot.
yeah, you don't have to go with 5. Sorry, I think it's fine. I was just going to say maybe I'll add to that list as well. So the visual hierarchy is one that you mentioned. The second is I want to put into that list uh, the demographic. I mean, is that fair to say that when you're building something, the demographic is a key aspect as
Oh
well?
gosh, yeah. Yeah, and that was going to be my second one, which is really understanding your user persona. But the user persona can be cliche, biased, just somewhat ignorant. I mean, there's only so much necessary research that one can do, and so many different personas that you can adjust to. I think honestly, the one thing that really excites me about artificial intelligence, machine learning, is the idea that we're moving towards a more um, uh, personalized world on the internet. Um, Machines are going to start learning a lot more about us and be able to, in theory, interfaces could adapt to our particular styles. And there's a lot more research in this, I think, era than in the past. For instance, individuals who are neurodivergent, who I'm working with one chat bot, and of course, chatbots tend to be very verbose, and I'm looking at it going like, even for me, this is a lot of text. For most users, this is just too much. And so, having the adaptability, if the chatbot knows, hey, Leigh is not so good with long text. She has a mild dyslexia. Here's how I can adjust this interface to meet her needs. I think that world's coming. I think it's going to, I'm very excited about it.
I'll
There,
tell you one more person who's excited about it. You may not know him, but hopefully, his name is Kramer. I've done a bunch of podcasts with Kramer about automated economy, and
uh,
Kramer feels strongly about many things related to automated economy, but hyper personalization
yeah.
is one item that is very close to his heart based on the conversations I've had with him. So I'm going to have him, look this conversation up because that's something he talks about all the time. Let me.
Yeah.
So you mentioned demographic. I want to add one more thing into that list: localization. And here's what I mean by localization. For the longest of time, localization means it's language and changing I-18N and internationalization and all of those kinds of things. But I think localization in my mind is more. There's more to it than that. You have to understand. We talked about personas and demographics, right? But the demographic is slightly higher level. I want to go even deeper. Even if the rest of the demographic is identical, but the population that I'm catering to lives in, say, the southern part of, again, I go back to India. I mean, I moved here when I was like 21. I've lived most of my life in the US, but I grew up my early years in India, and it shapes you very deeply as a person.
I
And
just so you know, I grew up in Southeast Asia. I went to high school in Singapore and Hong Kong, so I totally get it.
oh, wow. Okay, Singapore. That's great. There's another topic we could talk about because I have something to talk about Singapore in particular, actually.
Oh, excellent.
My wife is Indian, but she's from Malaysia. So we have a
Okay.
lot of family around that part of the world. So back to what I was going to say, right? So let's say if I'm building software, for a city that I come from in India, which is southern part of India called Chennai,
Mhm.
which is about like 200 kilometers east of like Bangalore. It's where I grew up. If you are building software, and I'm trying to make it very, very personalized and specific here, So some part of it could come across as manufactured, but if you're as picky as I, and some of us are very picky by nature, it's not manufactured. I'm being honest about this. Uh, Take that as a city. And if I actually, you know what, maybe I should share my screen and show the map, but it's the southern part of India. Now,
Okay.
let's say I'm solving a similar problem, but not for that part of the country. To say the northwest of India, right?
Mhm.
It's Rajasthan. I went to school there and to college there. It's the desert. It's very it's up north. If you built, if you're solving this exact same problem, but if you built an interface that looked identical, I don't think it's going to work out at all, because India is a beautifully diverse country with different languages. So if you just change the language from say Tamil to say Rajasthani, for instance, it's not going to cut it, because the thought processes, how people approach a problem, how they want to solve a problem, what they've been used to, all of that plays a significant role in where they want to see a button, or if they want to see a button at all to begin with.
Right.
But that localization, my question really is, it's easier said than done. I could sit here in Northern Virginia and think about localizing something for a product that I'm going to sell in Ghana, or say, uh, yeah, I don't know, Nigeria and Africa, or New Zealand. Well, New Zealand may not be a great example because there are more commonalities between, you know, I'll take New Zealand out of the mix here. I'm just taking more sizably different cultures.
Uh-huh.
Do people have to actually go? My question really is long-winded. Does the UI UX engineer? It's preposterous to say this, but do they have to take a plane, go there, spend a week or two, understand the culture before you come up with a design and say this is what I'm trying to do? Or are we living in a world where productization is so important that we want to churn out code and interfaces and everything so quickly? We are like, you know what? We'll go with the 80/20 rule. I'm not
Yeah.
going to be perfect, not even close. If this solves a problem in Northern Virginia, it's likely going to solve the problem in Seattle. Maybe it'll solve the problem in Tokyo as well. So I'm going to come up with a generic model, because I've seen cases where that has fallen flat, right? Otherwise, there's many reasons to explain why Amazon is not the most popular e-commerce site in many other parts of the world, why companies have had to collaborate with native companies. And I'll share an example with you, but with me having said so much, I just want to get your thoughts on these things.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're exactly right. Even when you're talking about towns, I'm gonna guess that those two areas you discussed in India have different economies. So let's say the one up north is more educated and possibly more city-like, and the one in
Now I
the
want to
south.
flip it. It's
Oh,
probably
flip
I
it.
want to flip, and I might be biased. I come from the south, but I want
Okay.
to flip it. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, and then one's a farmer, more rural area. But yeah, certainly localization definitely plays a part. I think there are um, certain aspects of culture you can generalize, right? So, for instance, if we're reading in English, um, uh, and so that's a big population, right? It's not small. If we're reading in English, we read left to right. Therefore, what ends up happening is we train our brain to read left to right, and therefore, the best place for a call to action is at the terminus. So, left to right, lower right hand side. After you're done reading, that's where you wind up. If you have your button top left, let's say, it can be very confusing. So, typically, buttons are on the lower right hand side. But that's not true if you read right to left, right? And so, things like that really come into play. Uh, excuse me, for localizations, like how you read. Another one is color. Huge one is color. White, or so in China or in Asia, white is representational of death, where the in the West it's black. Red means danger in the Western Hemisphere. Where am I getting that right? Anyway, we're in Asia. Red means luck. So,
Wow, you know what? That's interesting. Now it explains it, because I've used, when I go to some websites, like even in India, I've seen red, and it always came across to me as, okay, maybe something is bad, something is wrong.
right.
I did not realize that red was not universally, no, 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 it's not a no. So it means something
Yeah.
very different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so things like that can, yeah, exactly. You're talking about, if a U.S. company wants to go to Asia, and they do have to understand the cultural differences, to be able to help improve their chances and their
How important? So let me ask you a question as a playing the devil's advocate. If I
sure.
came to you and told you, well, we could do all of that, send somebody to India, have them spend a week or two, understand it, they'll get that much better because they understand a little bit about the culture, who they're building this product or this design for. Uh, it will surely make a difference. Or the argument is, you know what? We don't have the time or the money or the inclination to do any of that.
Right.
We'll just take a wild guess. Let's do it. If it's 80-20 rule, if most people can be helped with whatever it is that we're building, we're good to go. Both answers don't seem right or wrong to me. Uh, but they, am I wrong if I said that they could put you in a do or die or a make or break type of a situation, meaning it's not as unimportant as one might actually think that it is to begin with?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna give you an answer. I don't think it's maybe where you're going, and but this is kind of my personal philosophy. Having grown up in another culture and then coming back to the United States, I think it's given me a different perspective than most people. So I personally would argue for, spend the money, send the developer to the other country so that they can learn, because I think everybody should do that. But there's so right now, I'm learning LXD, or and I always forget, um learning experience design, because I'm moving more into the ed tech space, right? And so, whereas, like, this is kind of a different perspective on personalization. Whereas personalization can be great. For instance, if you're a neurodivergent learner, interfaces and content that adapt to your learning style and assist you in learning, right? There's that perspective. Personalization is great. In education, though, uh, you know, learning experiences. We learn experiences through reading. We learn experiences through interacting with different cultures. If something is super personalized, you wind up with a bubble, right? If every character in every book looks and acts like me, right? If you're doing like illustrations, and they all look like me, that does not give me the opportunity to experience other cultures and expand my worldview, and it creates a bubble. So there's a downside to personalization, right? So it's kind of going back to what you're saying, like, do we do the 80-20 rule? Do we do the super hyper personalized to the location rule? um i th- I think there needs to be a balance, and a choice. I think some individuals like like bubbles. That's all they want to be in. Some individuals like myself enjoy exploring other cultures. Um, so it's almost like, a choice would be nice. But I think I would lean more towards localization over the 80-20 rule, just because I think it if you target the majority, the common denominator amongst all of these individual experiences, I don't feel like that is a fertile grounds for innovation, right?
Right.
You're
And
just following patterns, and you're not only following them, but reinforcing patterns. You're part of, the reinforcement of those patterns. And I just it innovation suffers, your personal worldview suffers, and you're influencing the worldview of others, which you know
no,
isn't a
beautifully
good thing.
put. Beautifully put. I'm going to take two examples here to touch upon some of what you said there. For that, let me actually do a screen share. So I
Mhm.
have to tell me if you can see my. Oops, taking. I have a bunch of windows here, so I'm looking for that. Okay, I'm going to share my. Okay, do you see my screen here,
I do,
Lee?
yes. Hmm.
Okay, so this is one of our products, right? This is our web application. For instance, a project management app that you can use to manage your projects. I'm going to take a specific example. Oh, you know what? That's the production system. Let me log out of there. Let me go to a local. This I might want to mess with the data here. Okay, so I'm going to go. I'll take an example of a very simple thing. So in our world of project management, we have three levels of hierarchy, and you had mentioned earlier about visual hierarchies, and
Hmm.
functionally, our APIs support infinite hierarchy, but our UI implementation of one of our APIs actually stops at three because we went back and forth about making it either infinite or having like five versus two, and three was the sweet spot. It solved most of the problems, and we're like, you know what, more than three makes it difficult for somebody to understand through a user interface. At least that was our decision at the time. So we went to three levels of hierarchy, and at the highest level, we have something called a key, which is a project. And then when you go into a project, you have something called a block. You
Hmm.
break your problems down, and then you can have something called a pod, which is two ways of breaking the same problem down. A pod is a leaf, like a file. A block is like a directory. So you can have a block and you can have a pod underneath the block. At the highest level, those are the three levels of hierarchy. Now, if I just go to a chat version of it before I ask you the question. So this is the language we had chosen. A key, in our mind, it was a key to your problem, solving your problems. So you have many different types of keys, and then you have a block, and then you have pods.
Right.
And this language resonated well. We thought back, went back and forth within the team. All of us are located here in the US. We're like, "Hey, this makes sense. It's short, sweet, perfect." When after we went live, I can tell you this language resonated with people just much like we had thought. Say in the US, people, I mean, we didn't even have to train. There was no documentation. We shadowed with younger people, middle age, older people. There was not any significant trouble that at least we had come to learn about. The same product, when we socialize this with, say, folks in South Asia,
Hmm.
primarily in India, the repeated questions that we had been asked was, I don't know what a key is. What is a pod? What does it even mean? What is a block? It's confusing.
Hmm.
What is a pod under a block? What is a pod in parallel to a block? So we were like, what? I mean, we were not even prepared to answer these questions because for us it was a word with five letters, and typically our names are like 25 letters. So we were like, okay, five is better than 25 because my last name and my first name is more complicated than block or pod as a word. But that was not to be the case. This is a very genuine example that I can take. And
Perfect.
when we asked people what you might call this, it was all over the place, but very different. It was very, very different. I mean, I'm not a native English speaker either, but in India, most of us, at least a fair number of us, we learn in English. Uh, Majority, I think I would say, at least the people I know of. That's not to say there's no vernacular languages. People learn all languages, but I'm saying English is common enough. So it's not the question of understanding the word pod. I don't think people understood. Block, they do. We didn't know that. I mean, I was like, okay, pod was somehow a new word. It didn't even resonate with most people. But the combination of these keys, blocks, and pods, and how they could hierarchically go down like level one, two, three, it was to the point we were like, you know what, this is it. We love the language. We are primarily, advertising and marketing in the US and in Europe. So it is what it is. We don't want to change it, right? Not right now. Maybe we'll do it at some point later. But I want to take this as an example and
Hmm.
ask you a question before I
Great
go to the
example.
next one. How do you prepare for something like this? I mean, what could we have done differently, for instance, in such a scenario?
Yeah, that is a hard one. So I have been also teaching for 15 years. I love to teach code to non-coders, and introduce them to the fabulous world of all the magic that coding can create. But for same example, a lot of coding instructors will start talking about directories and this that and people's head explode when you start talking about directories, and then all I have to say is, oh, it's a folder, right? And in and that and by the way, the idea of folder comes from graphic user interfaces. It used to not be a folder, and then the analogy of a folder came into play with GUIs. And it's that analogy. People learn and understand. This is something that I'm learning through my learning experience design course, which is fascinating. But people build on their experiences, and so if they don't have the ability to build off their knowledge, you say pod, they think peapod, right? And then their whole world is broken when they're looking
Right.
at your interface. This again, so it's a super hard problem to solve, right? Because each person's analogy, somebody in the south of India is going to have a different point of reference than somebody in northeast China or something like that. Um, they're all going to have their individual points of reference. This is why, in my opinion, for instance, education is super um, uh, interesting and primed for this AI revolution, this machine learning revolution. But I will tell you, there's kind of a threshold, right? It's you know, so as a developer, do you customize to a certain area? And even if you do, are you going to hit all the individuals there in that region you were talking about who struggled with the word pod? Are you going to be able to really address all their needs by changing it over to, maybe file or whatever it is? Um, I think this is kind of it's like you can do a lot of work to personalize. I think all that work of personalization is going to eventually we're going to get there with artificial intelligence. But for now, you've got to this is where we'll tie it back kind of to the beginning. This is where your business comes into play. And this is where these decisions get made, where it's like it's too expensive to personalize. It would be great, but because, for instance, this particular group does not understand our interface, we may choose to get out of that market, or we may choose to generalize the wording in our product to fit that 80-20%. So
Correct.
this is where business strategy really comes into play. And sometimes, unfortunately, it depends on the situation. Sometimes, unfortunately, the answer is it is best for our company to get out of this market and move into other markets. And those are, that's where things can be, I think, a little heartbreaking for developers and UX UI people, where it's like, you have a really interesting problem and you really want to solve it, but the business comes in and says, we're not going to spend the funds on it. So it's like,
R-
that's all right.
Right. And then if I took, this question is easier if you took two different countries that are like 10,000 miles apart. The question becomes more difficult in my mind if you actually narrow it down to so let's say my question here, a rephrased version of almost the same question is, if I build something which is localized to, say, Kansas City,
Hmm.
I want to build something that's localized to New York City, to Seattle, to I don't know, to Dallas, Texas, to Pensacola, Florida, for instance.
Hmm.
We are a big country, the third largest in the world. Uh, but the difference is the cultural differences are, again, this is subjective, but at least the way I see it based on my early years growing up in India, they're not dramatic. Like I could drive like 3,000 miles, go to the West Coast and still find, what is it, Panda Express and McDonald's, and, the signs is the same. So you are, the difference is not as profound to me. Uh, so if I took these examples, Leigh, and is this problem only more complex if you went outside the country and you brought other parts of the world into the mix? Or do you think there's different ways the same problem could potentially manifest itself, even though I could say things are probably similar? Like I don't have to design a user interface very differently for Kansas compared to like New York City.
Yeah, I think, you know, a lot of times language, I think, unites us. So, even we were talking earlier about the language of a developer versus a designer is very different, and kind of finding that common ground. Language, I think, really. unites, I think, cultural groups, I think a little bit more so than, or a little more strongly than physical locations. But if you think of that, so if you think of it in dimensions like, okay, just in demographics, right? Location, specific city, then you get down into groups like, maybe males versus females, or certain age groups. You know, they're not going to all have the same experience. It's yes, they all live in the same town. Yes, they are of the same age group, therefore they might hang out and therefore have similar experiences. But there's so many more dimensions, right? Again, just kind of leaning on neurodivergence a little bit. Some of them might be on the spectrum for autism. Some of them may be, ADHD. Um, so they have different ways of processing
Right.
information. So it's not just like culturally what their context is, it's how their brains actually process information, which
Very
creates
important.
creates a
Yeah.
subgroup. Or they may have a physical disability, and if they're visually impaired, they may rely a lot more on their auditory senses. So I think, the dimensions are enormous, and it's a huge problem to solve. That's why people haven't solved it yet, right? There's personalization is still
No,
teetering
I
on.
think you hit on two very important points there. The second one could be a topic for another podcast, to be honest with you, which is inclusivity,
Mhm.
because that I think is a broad, important topic, which I think has not been given as much importance as it actually should be, in my opinion. But the easier one to talk about, the one you mentioned in terms of language unifying, I think it's a brilliant point. So, in other words, if you're a smaller company, as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, as a creator, if you have not as much money as you need and not as many people as you need,
Right.
maybe the way you focus, not so much by region but by language,
Yeah.
maybe the localization becomes a little bit easier if I'm going to make something that's all Spanish, all Portuguese, all English, for instance, right? That's, I think, a brilliant point that you made there. The second example that I want to bring up earlier when I shared my screen was, I'll give you an example of a product in India that my mom uses. They have a company that lets you, you could use the mobile app. They'll pick up stuff from your house and drop it off at your friend's place. This
Oh,
is
okay.
something my mom uses all the time, and of all the apps that she uses, if I had to make the list of top three that she likes, it could be Facebook is one of them, YouTube is another, and this could actually be the third one.
Wow.
More than anything else, more than ordering food, because they have people preparing food in the house. She has some help, but then she has to send it to the sister's place, or somebody is sending it from their house. So they have an app that basically does, hey, you know what? Pick up this stuff from my house, drop it off at the other place. Somebody comes there, picks it up, they drop it off, their job is done. So it's even more interesting than like Uber Eats to me, because it's not even, you're not picking up food from some other place. You're not even picking up food or anything. It could be anything that they can potentially carry on a motorcycle, for instance.
Hmm.
Now, how I could have possibly never thought of this as a problem
Right.
sitting in the US at all. No, not a chance. I could crack my head all, I mean, I could, rack my brains or whatever the right usage is all day long, but I'm never going to come up with that problem. But even when you do discover that problem, now how do you approach that solution? Every time I've used one of these apps, Lee, I can tell you, I've had like 40 comments about usability. To me, this is not even close to how I would actually design it. It's almost ludicrous or preposterous or whatever those broad words I would choose to use. Yet when my mom's using it, she's like, yeah, it's not too bad. I understand how this works. I'm like, wow. So this is, so the whole idea of when you mention UX and UI is, to me, is it's, there's not a simple black or white answer, good or bad. You
Hmm.
need to figure out the audience that is going to be actually the population that's going to be using what you're building, if it's good enough for that population, or if it's actually good for that population. I don't mean good enough, I mean good. uh, then I think you're in good shape. But this is where, as much as we talk AI, as much as all of us are you're excited about it, someone mentioned in my podcast yesterday about existential threat. Very valid point. But yet, there is a positivity, because the way I look at it is, the more tools you have, the more you can accomplish in the lifetime that we have on this planet Earth, for
Mhm.
instance. So the more tools we have, the better off we are, the faster we could possibly move. But maybe another topic, maybe for another day, is how can AI bridge this gap? I mean, in other words, when you read the news, when you read everything this year, especially, it's almost like none of us ever need to exist anymore.
Oh,
Right. We don't, there's Nvidia every day that you have to track, and there's every other stock, to the point that, sorry, this is a digression, but with the recent podcast, we talked so much about AI that I've actually started creating a podcast about stocks, which is not even my area of expertise by any stretch of the imagination, but to see how the market plays out, so we
yeah.
as engineers and developers can react to that market. It's very important to have the understanding. We talked a number of things. I can keep going.
Yeah, hold on. Yeah, you just hit on a really good point that I just kind of want to,
Oh no, no, please! I was going to tell you.
okay.
We can end the podcast when you're like, Krish, I'm done. I need break, because I'm enjoying this, and I enjoy. I can. The longest I think we've gone in a podcast was 2 hours and 25 minutes, and finally that person ran out of charge. So
Yeah.
just call out. It's 1 hour. I'm letting you know whenever you want to say, Krish, this is good. I'm more than happy, but please continue. Yeah,
Yeah, no, this has been fabulous, and I'd love to have more conversations with you. I love having, as a teacher, I just kind of have that passion for dialogue, and
totally.
but just talking about watching the industry and what's going on financially and artificial intelligence coming in, and do we have a job still, is super interesting. COVID hit, everybody worked from home, and now there's this financial crisis in the real estate market, right, for commercial real estate. um, do we keep the buildings we spent millions of
Yeah.
dollars, the campuses? There's this desire to work from home, nobody wants to go into the office, so that's creating a crisis in the commercial real estate business. So watching that financially has been super interesting for me. But also too, like, um uh I'm in the job market currently. I've got a couple side projects going on. It is I've always watched the job market. I do some career coaching for developers and for UX UI designers, and it is a tough market this year. Let me tell you.
I couldn't agree
Layoff,
more. I couldn't
yeah,
agree more.
and I think I'm very worried, especially because, for instance, we've got Code Pilot, we've got all of these artificial intelligence tools that are coming into play. People don't quite understand them. Like I personally have played around with artificial intelligence building UI. It doesn't do a great job.
Did you hear about Devin, the new tool?
Huh.
Okay, I'll send you the link. Devin, sorry to interrupt you there. You
Okay.
mentioned Copilot. Devin is one of the first things I read about yesterday, which essentially does end to end. It's the first example of something where somebody gave a requirement. I believe, if I remember correctly, reading that really quickly, it took the requirement, it actually Googled up documentation to see what methods and APIs it could potentially use. It then used those methods, created it, opened an editor and a terminal, wrote this whole thing, and it was able to actually address a number of existing bugs in a product by looking up a pull request. I mean, existing open issues, for instance,
Uh-huh.
on GitHub, and creating pull requests and going all the way up to there. And I want to get your thoughts on this, but let me tell you this, Leigh, which you all obviously might know. Even great engineers and developers I work with, what scared me was not other things, but what worried me was even the engineers who are highly respected and really smart developers actually denied or rejected the idea of this making a difference, which told me that, oh my god, is there some notion of denial happening here? Because I did not see that coming. I was
Yeah.
like, I didn't see that coming from certain people at all. And when I saw that coming from those people, it actually concerned me a whole lot more, meaning maybe there is more to this than meets the eye, for instance. And how do we react to this? I have like 16 topics that I would love to talk to you based on what we've actually, had this conversation about. I'm
Yeah.
just going to make a note here that I want to, hit upon these items. But please, before I interrupted you with Devin, you're talking about Copilot. Please continue.
Yeah. No, I mean, you're hitting on it though. Like, it's scary, but inevitably, so I do worry, for instance, for a long time, developers have been able to make a lot of money in the industry. Unfortunately, I think the tools are getting really good, and the expertise that has been required to get the development job done potentially is not going to be needed. Therefore, the salaries are going to drop. I say, and I believe there is a level of denial. It's scary. If you think about, for instance, graphic designers, or I mean, there's so many industries that this kind of change has happened to. Graphic designers. We used to, hand build things and cut things with X-Acto knives, and then Adobe products came into play. And I was teaching an Adobe Illustrator class one day, and I showed them how to get a image from the internet, plop it into Illustrator, and have it turn into a cartoon. And they were like, are you afraid that your job's gonna go away? And I was like, it's
It's
it makes.
interesting time to talk about Adobe. I don't know if you checked; they had their earnings today.
Oh,
Or
no, I haven't.
yeah, yeah, they're 14% down. Exactly. Maybe we can have a stock discussion. I was looking at it yesterday. One of the conversations around that was, with the Chat GPTs. Was it Sora? Right, that's what it is. I don't know if that has any impact, but it's natural now that you can create videos, the need to create videos. So it has a, you can be in denial all you want as anybody. But when I talked to my son yesterday, I was like, what, given this new Chat GPT thing, how's the market going to react to some of Adobe's products? And I was like, I'm not so sure. I feel like it's probably a time to short Adobe, not to buy, just
Yeah.
personally thinking. And then I saw it was 14% down. I was like, Krish, why did you not make that decision? You should not have chickened out. Yeah. But it's interesting. So uh, I think this is there's two ways to look at it, right? One way to look at it is, let's say nothing changed. Let's say
Yeah.
nothing ever changed. It's 2024. You
Right.
mentioned you've been in the business for a while. I've been, my just don't go with the color of my hair because it grayed even when I was in my 20s. But I've been doing this a while as well. Uh, and the reason we are doing this a while is because we like what we do.
Yeah.
Correct? Let's keep it very simple. I don't think DiCaprio is in the business of acting because he needs to make money,
Yeah.
because he needs to be popular. I don't think so. I call out for DiCaprio because my favorite actor, but you could take Robert De Niro, for instance, right? I mean, these are people who are doing this for like 50 years, not because they
Yeah.
have to do it, because their heart beats for doing it. The longevity of what you do is directly driven by how much you enjoy doing that. And I
Yeah.
say this because over a career that spanned many different years, several years now, I had the privilege of working with people who enjoy this business as much as I do, or even more so than I do. But I've also worked with a fair number of people. I want to say a large number of people who are in the business of building software because it actually pays well. I mean, it used to, at least, right? It pays
Right.
all right, and but their heart necessarily did not beat for building software. They would rather do something else. They would like to create content, for instance. It's like the research they're asking teenagers today, or Gen Z or Alpha, what do you want to do? I think the scary number is like 65% of them said, I want to be a TikToker, as we
Yeah.
talk about potentially banning TikTok in the country or something like that. But it's just the way the market works. So I think it's important to enjoy what you do, because then
Yeah.
you're going to continue finding ways to doing it. But there's two things this could pan out, right? One is nothing changed. We continue to build software exactly the same way it did. 20 years go by, a lot of us, we are at the tail end of our careers or retire or whatnot. And then AI comes into the picture. Now, what is the gain? You lived a life, you have the entire career. You did not have the opportunity to get into doing any of this because it just your ship kind of, I don't want to say sailed, but you're at that part of your life. Whereas this happening today means you get that opportunity to unlearn, relearn,
Yeah.
do things very differently. So this is like doing it all over again, but very differently. So, I was doing a podcast 2 days ago, a technical one, I think, a solo podcast, where I said, if I don't know how we should be building software going forward. But one thing I strongly feel is, if someone gave me a problem, Lee, and said, Krish, solve this, and if I approach the solving of that problem exactly the same way as I would have potentially done it last year, I think I'm doing it wrong. That's
Absolutely.
all I
Yeah.
can tell, right? That tells me, when I'm writing this code, if something tells me, Krish, you're typing this exactly the way you did it 6 months ago, I should take my hands off of the keyboard, go for a walk, take a coffee break or something, and come back and approach the problem differently. Because I think problem solving one more time is becoming an even more important skill, as it should have
Oh,
been all along. I don't think coding was the most important skill. I know I've said a lot of things. Sorry, I'll pause for a
no,
minute.
this is an exciting topic for me. So first of all, if you have never read the book Range, how what is it? I think How Generalists Can Survive in a Specialist World. Go check that book out. It
Okay.
really talks about, like, in my opinion, how to survive this new era that's upon us of formerly getting paid lots of money to be a specialist, and how problem solving, being a generalist, understanding multiple perspectives really it's beneficial, and the way to go. Where it's recommended. But so Range, great book. But so you're hitting at the heart of literally what I'm doing right now in my career. So people will go and look at my resume, or they'll look at my LinkedIn, and they'll go, "Oh, she's had a lot of different jobs. She's a generalist. She can't stick with one thing." And it's it's in there, and those are the people I don't want to work for. So they usually pass my resume by, and I'm happy about it. The people who I find to talk to, and they're far and few between, to be honest, but where I talk to them and they see my career as a progression, they see my continuous desire to keep up with trends and understand technology and different aspects of the software development role. They appreciate it, right? She's a product manager who's been a developer, who's been a UI designer, who's been a business owner, which are all the components that make up product management. People see me as a strong candidate. There are the algorithms and the HR recruiters who will look at it and go, she's too ADHD, or whatever they want to say
Right.
about me. So it weeds it out for me. I personally feel like, with the kind of introduction of artificial intelligence and things like that, people are going to have to move from being specialists to generalists, and get broader knowledge. It's almost like, not, they don't even have to. It's like they're going to be forced that way, because artificial intelligence, has that generalist perspective. It's got a broad
Absolutely.
range of knowledge, so they're just going to have to keep up. But the other part of what you're talking about is what I'm currently doing, which is curating your career. So I currently am in an industry that just does not speak to my heart. It does not speak to my passions. I am leaving that industry, and moving into education technology. I'm a little older. In my career, I can, like, not rely on, I don't have to rely on kind of the income and things like that. It's, I don't have I can let go of the golden handcuffs, if you will. But one of the most important reasons I am getting out of the company and the industry I'm in is because artificial intelligence is a huge movement, and I am not allowed to use it. I am not allowed to work in it. I am not allowed, it's like, because of restrictions, I'm not allowed to even touch it. And if I stay in the job that I'm in now, in a couple of years, it'll, the whole thing, like you said, the ship's going to pass by. I'm going to be unmarketable. And it's game over, right? If I step out now, what I'm doing is curating my career. If I step out now and pursue degrees in machine learning, I'm also pursuing a degree in a master's in learning experience design, so that I can get into that area I'm passionate about. That'll keep me relevant. But you're absolutely right. It's breaking down, starting from scratch, building up again. And people are so afraid of that. Um, and I've done it. I've reinvented myself. I've had 4 career changes. I've had to reinvent myself. There are certain, you can look at even celebrities who, they get to the height of the career, they have to break it down, they have to rebuild their brand. They have, there's
No, I'll
several.
take, I'll
Yeah.
give you another example of my favorite composer, all time favorite composer. His name is A.R. Rahman. He got a couple of Oscars for Slumdog Millionaire. It's not the best of movies, but
I
you
love that
might know
movie.
him by that. He's one of the most talented people I think that lives on planet from a music composer standpoint, right? I highly recommend you definitely check some of his song music out. He's been composing music for, I want to say, more than 3 decades now.
Hmm.
I take this example. People have asked me, as I run my startup, you have to wear several different hats on a daily basis. Some hats you wear because you have to, some you wear because you want to. Like sales and prospecting, we are a bunch of engineers, doesn't come naturally.
You know.
Last 3 months has been like me sending a message out, even to say reach out to like someone like you to say, do you want a podcast? Has been a seismic shift in my personality that I've had to make, because otherwise I could never get myself to go on LinkedIn and hit somebody up and say, can we have a chat? But 3 months of doing some of this part time, I've been able to do it. It's still, sometimes people don't respond. I take it personally. And I talked to somebody who's a sales engineer in Boston. He says, Krish, we send messages all the time. You can't take any of this personally, but it doesn't come naturally to me. The reason I lost my train of thought, that sometimes I have this long backstory that I
Uh,
want to say. Oh my God, Lee, do you know what I'm sorry, I don't know what I'm starting to say there. I want to
you were
set the,
talking. I don't know if you were headed towards like rejection. We were talking about
oh, sorry,
breaking
no, I
down
got
the
it.
composer.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Rahman.
Yeah.
So he composes music, and here's a really genuine example that resonates with me. He takes a lot of pain to do what he does. And it's you mentioned Bollywood. I don't watch Bollywood movies. I come again from different languages. I watch
Mhm.
Tamil movies. It's an industry that's as big as Bollywood as well. Uh, so he composes music in different languages. Every Let's say he spends 3 months, 3 to 6 months for an album. Puts a lot of effort, a lot of heart into it. It's brilliant. Like one of his recent compositions goes nowhere. It's an
Mhm.
absolute flop, goes nowhere, because the movie, typically it's not albums, it's songs for movies. So unless the movie does well, the albums do not do well. That's kind of how it works in India. It's not separated from the movies themselves. He picks himself up, doesn't matter to him.
Yeah.
He goes about the next one and the next one. In 30 years, I've seen a lot of the composers who've become popular, made a lot of money, and have a lot of fame back in India, who've lost their ways, because you see that the music kind of diminishes dramatically over the years because they take it for granted. You know what?
Yeah.
I'm going to get paid. This example of Rahman, he composes music, and when you hear him talk, he behaves like a developer who's starting out right
Yes.
after graduating, because that
Uh-huh.
that zeal and that enthusiasm and that passion is still there, because the title doesn't matter. He was a composer 30 years ago. DiCaprio and Robert De Niro were actors 30, 40 years ago. Like in case of Robert De Niro, probably more than 40 years ago, I would imagine. The title is still an actor, right? The title is not what's keeping them alive or doing what they want to do. Uh, I think it's, to me, sure, not everyone's a DiCaprio, not everyone's a Rahman, but I look at code as art, because I don't know how else to
Yes,
create
it
like the
is.
beautiful art that's behind on your wall behind there. So if you treat that with respect, you will accept that it needs to change, it needs to
Yeah.
adapt, it needs
Evolve.
to be done differently, it needs to evolve, the better word there. So it's not a question of, I think AI in my mind is going to weed out everybody who didn't want to do this to begin with, or weed out people who are probably unfortunately not the best at whatever it is that they were doing.
Yeah.
I feel like the industry is going in the direction of where there's going to be maybe fewer people doing it potentially, but people who enjoy doing it, they wouldn't do anything else because they don't know how to do anything else, because they have no other skill, much like myself, or they actually enjoy this thoroughly that they want to continue doing it. So, I mean, you have to weigh the pros and cons. And you mentioned your experience of, pausing, making decisions, relearning.
Hmm.
Relearning also means unlearning some of what you would have
Yeah,
possibly learned in the past as well. So
absolutely.
what would be your recommendation to somebody who's, let's say, given, I guess we might be at the same point in our careers, give or take, I presume. So let's say somebody who's done this for a fair number of years, and they're, I don't know if you've read this poem by Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
it's one of my favorite ones, right? So it's when I read it as a teenager, and I thought it was only when I got into college, is the road, which road should you take? And then do you migrate, do you not migrate, for instance? But then you realize that poem is so beautiful that it manifests itself in different ways on a regular basis. I mean, the roads
Mhm.
are not, those decisions might not be as profound or dramatic, not all the time, but yet you got to make these decisions. Do you go this way? Do you go that way? And you pause, you reflect, and then you move on. What would be your recommendation? And I'll give you one more pointer just for your answer. Did another solo podcast. I do 90% tech podcasts, but some I not so tech, very few. But one of them I mentioned where, uh, you know what, before I go there, I want to get your thoughts on what would you recommend to somebody who's done this a while, who's finds themselves in a position where they're going to have to make some adjustments. Life is kind of going to change.
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I was a straight A student. I got all the good grades, and I went to art school, graduated just fine, magna cum laude. But I think b- art school's a little different. I think art is subjective, and I think really what being an art student taught me was how to fail, how to teach myself, how to pick myself up, just like you were talking about, from those rejections and start all over again and just keep trying. Life is an experimentation. I think that people in certain industries are, especially those who are very well versed in a topic, much specialists. They're used to being correct. They're used to being accepted, and they're used to always getting A's, right? And learning something new is super hard. I've been an instructor for over like 15, 20 years, and I've watched different types of learners. Some learners think they're uh, too novice and are terrified to build on their knowledge. Some are maybe too smart in another area and just are terrified of being wrong for the first time, right? Like getting something wrong. And I think the biggest advice I could give is really ad- adopt, you know, get used to being rejected. It's not a good feeling. I've been doing this for, I've had this philosophy for most of my life. Like, I did a painting and somebody hates it. Most people hate it. And so now I've got to, go back and try and recommunicate my idea in a different way. But like rejection is incredibly painful. Even today, I send out my resume, I get a rejection letter, and, you know, my partner will tell you, I'll be, whining and sulking on the couch for an hour or something, especially if it's a job I really wanted. But it builds resilience. And rejection, people take it so personally, but again, there's so many variables going on as to why somebody doesn't like or likes something you've done. um and that's not the point. The point is that you enjoy it, right? That's what art's about. You're expressing yourself. People can reject it or accept it, doesn't matter, right? It's a different concept than grades like A, B, or C. You're building something because you have a passion. But um, I would agree with you, like this idea of, you can be a specialist. And again, I highly recommend the book Range. It talks about this. You can be a specialist, and then, you start to dip, and you're not going to stay up with the world. You're not going to be able to keep up with the world if you keep on that same pattern, that same trajectory. You do have to bring yourself back down. Try something else, even something as simple as learning another language. And I'm talking about not coding language, just like, learn Spanish. Gives you a whole new perspective on how language is created. That can be applied to, for instance, I don't know how, I'm just using it as an example, but potentially could change the way you write code, right? Learning different topics, expanding your world. Again, this is kind of, and I'm just going to kind of hit on this one more time. This is where personalization gets super scary, right? If it creates a bubble, you're not expanding your world. So there is certainly a balance. But, I think my life has just been super enriched by living in another country, living with other cultures, being a coder and a designer and a product manager and a business owner. It's not like they were isolated incidents. Each one of those topics influenced how I perceived the next topic. Right now, I'm writing a paper on how dry principles in coding, right, and componentizing and separation of concerns in coding should apply to curriculum building in education. So
Wow.
I learned to think about a problem here. I learned a new topic. Oh, hey, see how this applies here? So they're not isolated, right?
Which kind of goes to my what I mentioned about problem solving, right? You know how to solve a problem. You can take the fundamentals, the design patterns of that solution, like in your case, the dry principles or the separation of concerns at the highest level. It's a very programming construct, but you're able to take that because it helped you solve certain programming problems better and differently, so you're able to apply that in another facet of whatever it is that you're doing essentially.
Mhm.
But more, I think the fact that you said about rejections, I think it's very, very important. I just want to say that I couldn't agree more. And I think how everybody reacts to it is very different, very different. We're going to add interviews as an example. I shared this experience in a podcast, I think, about live interviews, live coding interviews.
Mhm.
It works for some people, it doesn't work for other people,
Not
and I
me.
have strong opinions about it. And sometimes the way the system works, it's this process of elimination. We have 8 billion people in the world today, give or
Mhm.
take. I think by the end of the century, maybe sooner, we're going to hit like 12 billion people. That's like a 50% growth in population. That's insane. I don't
Yeah.
know how this planet is meant to actually support 12 billion people, but that's a different problem altogether. Which means there's going to be a lot more people, and you're going to have to do lesser because machines are going to do a lot more. So, do the math. More people, lesser things to do. It is going to create some interesting situations that people have to find ways to work themselves out of. There's no silver bullet, because I keep mentioning Rahman or DiCaprio because I think titles, some people love titles. Nothing wrong in them. I've never chased them. It's not something that excites me. A lot of our contracts, Lee, just says we need Snowpal to do X. We don't even have a title, for instance, right? It's like, doesn't matter. Whatever the
Mhm.
problem is, we're going to have to do it, for instance. So I think when you said rejections, this is what resonated with me. People have to take everything as it's meant to be, sort of be a fatalist to some extent, and take that opportunity to see what else they could potentially do. Because I think, I don't know the name of the actor who came in the Netflix series. I don't watch Netflix much, but it was like a Canadian convenience store, Kim's Convenience. Actually, it's called
Mhm.
Kim's Convenience. His name is, I don't know, it's SIU. I'm not sure. Then he acted in a Marvel movie, and then
Okay.
he used to, you can look it up. He used to work for, I think, Deloitte, and I think he wrote a post on LinkedIn saying the best thing that happened to him was him getting laid off at Deloitte. Basically,
Yeah.
otherwise he would have just been a consultant. Even though he didn't really want to do that, he wanted to be an actor, and he didn't make the decision. It was imposed upon him. Somebody
Yeah.
said, "No, your job ended." But he took that opportunity to explore other things. And I can say, that works well for a lot of people, because you sometimes feel guilty to make those decisions because you feel like you have a certain purpose, you got to keep chugging along. But when it's pushed upon you, you're like, you know what, it's not my fault. They are restructuring, so now let me rethink what I could possibly be doing. And for anyone watching this, the first thought could be, okay, Krish and Lee might be sitting in a place of privilege to be selective about doing this. I want to say not at all, right? Because it depends. Everybody's in a place of privilege compared to somebody else. You look at the news every day, Musk is having fun, and I'm like, wow, it'd be nice to not be necessarily wealthy, but to be able to have the kind of wield the kind of power that he seems to do, that he's always in the news, for instance.
Yeah.
So we're like, hey, you're sitting in a place of privilege or power, but we don't know what people do to get to where they need to get
Yeah.
to. So everyone makes that effort. So I want to be very clear. It's uh, doing what you like to do, what you love to do. I don't think it comes from a place of privilege, because I watch these YouTube videos and there are people who don't make a lot of money, make sell street food in different parts of the world,
Yeah.
and they are very happy,
Yeah.
and they thoroughly enjoy doing that, for instance. And I'll say one more thing before I mic back to you, which is, you mentioned languages.
Hmm.
I recommend a YouTuber called Bald and Bankrupt. His name is Benjamin. His channel is
Okay.
called Bald and Bankrupt. I only have subscriptions, like 7 YouTube channels. He's one of them.
Okay.
A brilliant, brilliant British guy who speaks English. Obviously, he's British. He speaks Russian. He
Wow.
speaks Hindi
Wow.
quite a bit. He speaks a fair bit of Spanish. And I think he speaks some Portuguese as well, from what I've seen in the videos. He actually took a year to learn Spanish before he went to South America to make videos. Now, how many YouTubers will actually take the effort with 4 million subscribers, with making a fair bit of money, to learn a different language? So I'm saying it's not just DiCaprio, it's not just Rahman, it's not just Leigh or Krish, it's Bald and Bankrupt. There are people who love what they do. They give it everything that they have. It's just few and far between. So we may not run into those people on a daily basis. It's not a commodity, right? Bald and
Right.
Bankrupt is not a commodity. YouTube's got 50 million channels. He's one of them, but he's clearly not one of them. He's quite different in things that he does and how he approaches a certain problem. uh, I know I know I've been rambling. I just want to say that the fact that you said rejections and taking them gracefully
Yeah.
is important. I think it's important for everybody, because today somebody will be watching this and saying, you know what, I've never ever been rejected.
Right.
That's great.
Which
And
means you've never
maybe
risked anything.
that, or you've just been on the
Or
lucky
learned
side of
anything
the
new.
draw
Yeah.
or the coin, right? But that doesn't mean things hopefully things don't change and you don't ever get rejected. But it's better, what I try to say in one of my last podcasts was, if you build a lifestyle around the least your job can pay,
Hmm.
I think you could be a little bit more peaceful, in my opinion. Imagine a React developer getting paid at the peak of React being development, right?
Yeah.
And Leigh says, okay, I'm making X dollars an hour. I'm going to buy everything I want because React is the thing to happen. And then something else comes along. Maybe more people are doing RxJS alongside React or something preposterous. You have to change your lifestyle because things have changed. Is a more seismic shift. So people
Yeah.
can, I always go with, what's the least that somebody could pay me for what I'm doing, right?
Yeah.
Let me build a lifestyle around that to some extent, which means, that's potentially the least I could get paid. It's all right. And if you get paid more because the market's better, that's fine, obviously, but you're not hell bent on that happening. You're not
Yeah.
desperate. It's like having a hand in poker, and you get so committed, you see through the flop and the turn. Now you're waiting for this river card, and even though the river didn't, you didn't, there were 18 outs or 17 outs, and you didn't hit one of those outs, but your pot committed. You're like, you know what? I'm like $3,000 into this pot. I'm going to put the
Keep
other
it.
$1,000 in as well. That's why there is something called tilt in poker. But I realized tilt is not just in poker. Tilt is applicable to life as well. When you're
Mhm.
frustrated, you're just going to act upon it very poorly. I know we started this topic as transparency. I'm going to just say before we end this podcast, Leigh, that I'm going to probably retitle the podcast, because we
I was gonna
talked
say we've kind of diverged. Yeah.
a number of different topics, and I think it's very natural, because every time I talk to a fellow developer, it's like you're talking to yourself. It's
Yeah.
just that they look, they don't, they look different because they're another person, but otherwise it's a mirror. I felt the
Yeah.
same thing when I was talking to, I think, Jason, who I used to work with. He lives in Alaska, and I was like, Jason, you're saying something, and I'm like, I feel like I could be saying the exact same thing.
Yeah.
It's just that I want to say maybe a better looking person is saying it. That's the only difference. Yeah, but I don't know. This is amazing.
Yeah.
I will let you wrap this podcast up the best way you can, Leigh. However you want to summarize the gist of our
Oh boy.
conversation.
Yeah. Well, I will point out, by the way, what you just said about another developer looking in a mirror. The thing that strongly unites us is language, right? It's a coding language, but it is a language that unites us. It's just another
It's more than
example.
one language, right? It's
Yeah.
English
Oh
as a
yeah.
language, right?
A
It's
lot of
English as a
dialect.
language,
Yeah.
and then coding as a second language,
Yeah.
because it's very important. Language is very important because I speak, I guess, three languages, but two on a regular basis. English is one of them, and Tamil is my native tongue.
Hmm.
So that's what we speak at home, like, back and forth, back and forth. And but you think in a certain language about a certain topic. Like, I could not think of engineering in my native tongue, because I never learned engineering in Tamil, so I just cannot do it. But when you talk movies, the first language that resonates in my mind is my own language, and then I translate it implicitly to English when I express that to somebody else. But I think it's this, yeah, anyways, we find unity in this day and age where people find reasons not to find commonalities. I think it's a good thing. Whatever it is you can find that you feel like it makes you some more in sync with the next person, just embrace it, because I think the world could do with a lot more of that stuff.
Yeah, I think so
Yeah.
too.
So
Uh,
how do you want to summarize this? It's a very easy thing. 90 minutes of us
yeah.
talking 25 different topics. How
Yeah.
difficult can it be? It's like adding a button on a page. Like, I did another podcast where, how difficult is it to add a button on a page? Well, it's more difficult than you make it sound to be, is what I summarized that podcast with. What should be the size of this button? What's the color? What's the placement of it? What does it look like every other button in the product? Should it look like every other button in the product, or is it supposed to look different? But that's a different topic. Sorry, back to you.
Yeah, I think, to summarize, so we kind of talked about transparency, and really what kind of got the conversation going was the divide between, product managers and UX UI designers and developers, and that divide our business. And I think it really boils down to what we got to, which is there is a gap in language, right? They're speaking different languages. And language could be everything from words we speak to the code we write to the shapes and symbols we put on a page. So, those are all languages, different types of languages. And being able to communicate, I think, is now more than ever super important. So, and I don't think a lot of people learn outside their language. Maybe they've lived in the same town their whole lives, they've done the same thing for their job their whole lives. But in addition to each culture, each culture and location speaking different language, each um, uh, job title, each role, finance speaks a different language than developers, than designers. So learning the language of a particular job role, I think, is very important. And then to kind of wrap it all up, uh, learning, right? So if you're learning another role or another perspective or another language, is hard, because you're not going to be, especially if you're used to being an expert, you're not going to be an expert. You have to be a beginner again. But in this day and age, those who succeed are comfortable being beginners. They're comfortable being rejected or being wrong. I love the acronym. What is to fail? First attempt at learning, right? That is what failing is. You tried it, it didn't work. You learn from it, you move on. Failing is the best way to learn. And if you're, and again, talking about bubbles, if you're at that experience level and you're not learning, you're in a bubble, and the world's going to change like it has with artificial intelligence, and you're not going to be prepared. And that's super scary. So, be flexible, learn to be a beginner again. I can't tell you how my life has been, just, I just have enjoyed my life so much with teaching, because it forces me to become a beginner again, just to teach a topic. And sometimes I'm not as familiar with a topic as I'd like to be, but learning new things from a beginner's perspective leads to innovation. It leads to growth. It leads to, a better worldview for all of us. So yeah, that's it.
Perfect. And usually I try to start the podcast with a simple question. Since I didn't ask that, I'm going to end it with that question. What's your most favorite food and why?
Oh, ramen hands down. But not like the I mean, you can get better ramen these days in the United States, but like my all-time favorite, memory of going to a restaurant was being in Tokyo and going, they have these little ramen shops with just the most amazing ramen. And then you can get a beer for like $3 and you get your bowl of ramen. It's super cheap and, Tokyo's super expensive, but it was always, ramen was just, and when I lived in Asia,
I was
uh,
just going to say, in Singapore
yeah,
as well, probably.
yeah, so just amazing ramen there. So it is, it's different than when you buy the packet in the store. It's fresh. It's amazing. So yeah, ramen's my favorite food.
Okay. And the second part, the question is a little bit more difficult. What's your favorite? I don't know if you eat Indian food, but if you do, what's your favorite Indian food?
My favorite Indian dish right now, like, so first of all, I love roti prata, but I'm a diabetic, so I can't eat too much of it. But yeah, but I'd say like butter chicken is my go-to. Just yeah, butter chicken. But I love curry. To the point, actually, I went home to Singapore to visit my dad for Christmas. And on Christmas Day, I went to the hawker stalls and just ate as much, like for like 2 or 3 days, I just ate curry. And I was on the flight back from there, and I'm just popping acids left and right. But yeah, I love curry as well.
Yeah,
All
Singapore
kinds.
has got some, it's just amazing. I want to say, if you want to have good Indian food, India is obviously the first choice. But if you're not in India, you want to have good Indian food. The second best place that I've had the best Indian food has been Singapore. It's just
Yeah, Singapore has
outstanding,
amazing food. Yeah.
especially if you like South Indian food. Singapore has, I think, the best South Indian food outside of India at the same level as India.
Is South Indian food the one that's primarily vegetarian?
Uh, I
There's
mean,
a
India
region.
has vegetarian food across, the
Yeah.
board. But in Singapore, the third official language is Tamil. My native
Yep.
tongue is the third official language. So a lot of the restaurants that you would find in Singapore are actually a fair number of them are like restaurants that are from my part of the state world in India, right? So it's South Indian vegetarian food is more common in Singapore, just
That's
because folks happen to come from that part of the world.
okay. So, question for you. I used to go to this restaurant, and we had what we called football bread. It's a very thin bread, but it puffs up to
Oh
be the
yeah,
size
that's North Indian. That's called batura, chole
of a
batura.
tura.
You eat that with chickpeas, probably a chickpea
Or you
curry.
have the little dips. You have like 10 little dips, and you take the bread and you dip it, and it's all
Oh, you know what?
vegetarian.
What you're talking about? There's a South Indian version of it which doesn't puff as much. There's a
Mhm.
really big one which is called the batura, which
Uh-huh.
is really big that you have with chickpeas. Then the South Indian version of it is a little bit smaller circles. It's a little bit
Yeah.
flatter. And then you have the thali that you can eat with like many different things that you dip and eat, for instance, right?
Yeah, that
So
was my favorite. I loved that restaurant because it was always, you could just try different things.
yeah,
Yeah.
I tell people who ask me Indian food recommendation is either go to India or go to Singapore. If you can't go that far, take a plane, go to England because the Brits spent a fair bit of time in India, so
Yeah.
they did learn how to make that. It's brilliant. The Indian food in England is great. The one place that you never want to step into an Indian restaurant, sad to say, is America.
Yeah,
If you want good Indian food, America is not the place. Sad, it doesn't matter where you are, whether it's New York or San Francisco or DC, for
yeah,
instance. Yeah. Oh,
for
but
sure.
this is super awesome,
Yeah, I had a
amazing.
great time.
Thank you so much, Leigh. And any links that you want me to include for people to reach out to you and whatnot, just let me know,
Sure.
and we'll include that. So one more time, folks, it's Leigh Lawhon.
Mhm.
She has an extensive background in product management, front end development, and UX UI design. Leigh taught coding and design for over 15 years, and she's a lifelong learner, which is obviously apparent from the conversations we've had so far, and is currently learning LXD and machine learning. And I'll include all the links that Leigh gives me, and please, feel free to reach out. And thank you very much.
Thank
My
you.
apologies that this is a whole lot lengthier. The average podcast is about an hour, 10 minutes ish. The longest was like 2 hours, 15 minutes. This is very close, but I had a fantastic time chatting.
I did too. Well, thank you so
Thank you.
much. All right.
I'm just gonna stop the recording. You want to stay there just so it completes the upload.